Hi everyone, my name is Rosie Bsheer and I teach history at Harvard University. First of all, it's a pleasure to be part of this important conference. Thanks to the organizers for the invitation and for the flexibility in accommodating someone currently based in Beirut. My recent work has centered on the politics and materiality of history making and its relationship to modern statecraft. Today, I will talk about some of this work and how producing and territorializing a singular top-down historical narrative out of many entangled ones are belligerent but normalized acts of state formation. These are acts that necessarily rely on the destruction, containment, and silencing of the evidentiary terrain. In this sense, the state-sanctioned construction of the past is the continuation of war by other means. As networks of knowledge production and transmission, heritage sites are technologies of everyday violence that embody ongoing social relations and struggles over power. In times of peace, as in war, they are terrains of symbolic and material contestation, whose creative destruction can be deployed for political and economic reasons. Authorizing and constructing the past are therefore bureaucratized, everyday state efforts that normalize history through archives in the built environment, for legitimation purposes, for sure, but also to pacify political opponents, diversify national economies, and monumentalize state power. We can see examples of such dynamics everywhere, in the Standing Rock Reservation in North America, or in Istanbul, Mecca, and Tel Aviv in the Middle East. Much has been written about the antagonistic politics, constructed nature, and destructive tendencies of history writing and heritage making. Yet rarely do these bureaucratized, ubiquitous technologies of power evoke sustained and broad-based public outcries. If many across the world have been appalled by the transgressions of Islamist groups against statues, monuments, and historical spaces in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, comparatively few seem to protest the simultaneous state destruction of heritage elsewhere. Let's take the case of contemporary Iraq as an example. Universal neglect of attacks against heritage there was flagrant, beginning with the first US war on Iraq in 1990. The US military inflicted extensive damage upon Iraq's cultural heritage during the so-called Operation Desert Storm. The US war, coupled with the catastrophic UN-brokered sanctions on Iraq, caused unprecedented damage to Iraq's material history. And with a thriving global market for antiquities from the region, the illegal trade in Iraqi cultural artifacts proliferated, with many ending up in places like Paris, London, New York. The deleterious effects of the 1990 Gulf War reverberated across the Middle East. In a place like Saudi Arabia, for example, the state quickly embarked on a multi-billion-dollar secular heritage industry in Riyadh, an industry that included museums, archives, and commemorative spaces. The regime sought to recreate an imagined past whose material traces had been all but demolished along Haussmannian lines in decades past. This heritage industry necessarily relied on the simultaneous mass destruction of historical as well as sacred space across the country. Space that countered official Saudi history, and this was most visible in Mecca, but it was also visible elsewhere in the country. These technologies of power and the overhaul of the Saudi political economic system they ushered took specific shape in response to the challenges of the 1990 Gulf War. One central challenge that led to these changes was the sustained domestic opposition that emerged, both to the war and to the stationing of thousands of US troops inside the country. And if you recall, the Saudi regime sided with the United States in its war against Iraq. The domestic Saudi opposition combined with the post-war global economic recession and exposed the Saudi regime's political, military, and economic weakness. One of the pillars of the regime's post-war responses was therefore to reconfigure its power based on historical revisionism and commemoration. Archives, museums, and commemorative spaces became technologies of knowledge production, of state formation, and of infrastructural power that aimed to territorialize national history, pacify wartime opposition, and create new economic value in the built environment. Breaking with the past, or attempting to occlude its multiple traces, is a common feature of modern state formation. The modern state, imperial or otherwise, often necessitates the selective erasure of certain histories and the incompatible truth and socialities they mobilize, and then replacing them with modes of being and remembering that correspond to the modern state form. In the case of Saudi Arabia, the US Oil Corporation, or Aramco, and US bureaucrats were central to aligning these incompatible histories from both Saudi and US historiographies and archives. This is, of course, in addition to aiding in defeating Saudi Arabia's oppositional movements at various points since the 1940s. In any case, and despite all this, states and imperial projects of heritage making often receive global recognition from international media outlets and multilateral institutions, recognition that perpetuates an understanding of historical preservation as an apolitical and technocratic process, an enlightened global public good, if you want. This is as true of the New York Times as it is of UNESCO. Not only are these institutions largely silent on the contentious construction of heritage in places such as Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States, but they also ultimately serve to legitimize them. Historians and other scholars turned detectives are left to search for traces that may have survived these acts of destruction, a search made harder by the ever-improving and deepening technologies of destruction, as well as state and imperial efforts to police the production and transmission of knowledge. I have therefore come to think of archives and commemorative spaces as sites of war that embody and reflect inter- and intra-state struggles and state-society struggles over power. The post-September 11 US invasion and occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq, and the world that ushered in, make that very clear. Under the guise of the so-called global war on terror, states around the world increased investments in technologies of policing knowledge production and crushing domestic opposition, all, of course, in the name of fighting terror. We saw that in Egypt, we saw that in Syria, we saw that in the United States. This was definitely the case in Saudi Arabia, which, in addition to mass arrests in the aftermath of 2001, saw an accelerating wave of mass demolitions of heritage sites. Traces of these arrests, traces of this destruction, are becoming harder to ascertain, even for those of us who have experienced and were embroiled in these practices in the years after the 9/11 attacks. Let me go back to heritage as a site of war. US imperial forces used history and heritage as political tools to subjugate the Iraqi people. In the first weeks of the 2003 war, the US military and political leaderships refused to safeguard Iraq's cultural properties. While the US government was at once downplaying the looting that occurred and justifying it, its officials were planning the transfer of millions of Iraqi archival documents and various artifacts to the United States. Mere months later, reports poured in claiming that US troops were ordered not to intervene in the looting of archives and monuments and were actively encouraging such theft. The reports showed that the cultural cleansing that took place was central to the US imperial agenda in Iraq. It was an instrument of war through which the US government attempted to defeat Iraq, subjugate its people, and erase its history, some of which, of course, implicates the United States in processes such as, or events such as the Iran-Iraq War, or the massacres that Saddam Hussein committed against Iraqis. Researchers estimated that the US military stole about 89% of the former regime's documents in the first few months of the occupation. So extensive was the damage to Iraq's heritage, so prevalent the sale of cultural property, that by 2005, the UK World Monument Fund unprecedentedly designated the entire country of Iraq as an endangered site. Yet beyond the initial media frenzy, the US government received little criticism outside of scholarly and preservationist circles for the plundering of Iraqi archives and the damage its invasion and occupation inflicted upon Iraq's heritage. The same can be said of similar practices by other regimes, both domestically and otherwise. And you can think here of Israeli practices across historic Palestine, but also in Lebanon, UK practices across the country and in the UK's former colonies. And we can think about Saudi practices domestically, but also in Yemen, where Saudi and Emirati-led coalition forces deliberately targeted 78 cultural and archaeological sites that are confirmed, among many others that are still not reported, of course using US-made bombs. This starkly contrasts with the global condemnation of the theft and destruction of heritage committed by the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, or Taliban. This is to say nothing of media outlets and preservationist agencies ultimately framing the destruction of material history only by terrorist groups as more tragic and reprehensible than the loss of life, or rather, I should say, the loss of presumably Muslim life. This is a reality that many in the colonial and post-colonial worlds have long had to contend with, and one that has been increasingly familiar since the September 11 attacks. Journalist complicity with state and imperial power runs deeper and is structural to 21st century technologies of power. Here we can think of the embedded journalism of the United States 21st century wars. We can also think of the discovery in 2013 that US news organizations agreed to remain silent for 2 years about the existence of a secret US drone base in Saudi Arabia. The base's exact location remains unconfirmed. We have traces of it appearing on some GIS tools, but not the most popular ones. Say Google, for example, and others, which usually have mega contracts with the US government. The US has been using this secret drone base to launch attacks in Yemen, sometimes against US targets, all in the name of national security. And it has unsurprisingly refused to divulge any information about this and other bases, also, of course, in the name of national security. The bureaucratic practices I'm describing, whose technologies are regularly transferred between states, are normalized pillars of modern statecraft, from the construction and destruction of history and heritage to the policing of knowledge production in general. That a central aim of these practices is to obscure the violence on which state and imperial formation relies, and to then repurpose it in the service of the state, only foregrounds the importance of traces to the historian's craft, and to uncovering these everyday forms of state violence that many of us have come to accept. Thank you for listening.